It's 1978. A Chilean archaeologist named Pablo Vargas is crawling on his hands and knees along Easter Island's southern road, not the famous platform, not the statues, the road itself. He slides a piece of paper between two stones. It doesn't fit. Your smartphone is thicker than the gap between these ancient blocks, yet they were placed here without mortar, without modern tools. How? Roughly 1,000 years ago, without metal tools, without mortar, and here's the detail that stopped Vargas cold, without any written record that the road was ever meant to exist. That single gap, smaller than a millimeter, is the question this video is built around. 7 monuments. 7 engineering problems that have not been solved. Not minimized, not explained away, genuinely, structurally unsolved. And before we're done, one of them will require us to throw out an assumption you've held since the first time you heard the word *ancient star. 1. Göbekli Tepe, Turkey, 9600 BCE. We start at the beginning. Literally. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is the oldest known monumental structure on Earth. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who excavated it from 1996 until his death in 2014, described it not as a settlement but as a sanctuary built by people who, according to the standard model of history, had not yet invented agriculture. Let that breathe for a moment. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. No cities. No surplus grain. No administrative class to organize labor. And yet they quarried, transported, and erected T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, into precise circular arrangements, decorated with bas-relief carvings of animals so detailed that modern sculptors have called the technique sophisticated. The site covers 22 acres. Only roughly 5% has been excavated. In the records I've kept on Neolithic construction, no site breaks the assumed timeline quite like this one. The current explanation, that spiritual motivation alone organized massive communal labor, is accepted by most archaeologists. But it explains the *y*, not the *how star. The limestone was quarried from a ridge 100 meters away using flint tools. The heaviest pillars would have required hundreds of coordinated workers and a rope and lever system of extraordinary precision. No ropes have been found. No levers. No tools beyond flint. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, intentionally backfilled by the people who built it. No one can explain why. 2. Sacsayhuaman, Peru, circa 1400 CE. The walls of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco are assembled from stones that weigh up to 120 tons. The largest known block is estimated at 360 tons, roughly the weight of 3 fully loaded Boeing 747s. The Inca moved these stones without the wheel. Without iron. Across mountain terrain. And they cut them so precisely that the joints, as Pablo Vargas found on Easter Island, refused to accept even a sheet of paper. Spanish chronicler Pedro de Cieza de Leon visited Sacsayhuaman in 1553 and wrote that local Inca informants told him the walls had been built by beings who came before a word that the Spanish translated as demons but that Andean scholars now read as ancestors of uncertain origin star. Modern engineering studies, including one from the University of Salford in 2020, confirmed that even with contemporary quarrying equipment and crane technology, replicating the joint tolerances of Sacsayhuaman's outer walls without damaging the stone faces would be, and this is a direct quote, technically non-trivial. Technically non-trivial. That's peer-reviewed language for we don't know how they did it. But here's where the story shifts. The twist. Up to this point, you've probably been framing these monuments the way most documentaries frame them, as evidence of lost technology. Techniques that existed, peaked, then vanished. What 3 records I'll show you in the next 2 minutes suggest is almost the opposite, that several of these sites weren't built by people who lost knowledge. They were built by people who never needed to write it down, because the knowledge wasn't stored in documents. It was stored in the stones themselves. The geometry is the record. Hold that thought. because the next 3 sites are going to make it uncomfortable. 3. The Great Pyramid, Giza, circa 2560 BCE, 2.3 million blocks. Average weight, 2.5 tons. Heavier casing stones, up to 15 tons. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across 230 meters of bedrock. Modern laser surveys have confirmed that number repeatedly, and it still produces a specific kind of silence in engineering rooms when someone reads it aloud. 2.1 centimeters. The tolerance of a contemporary concrete foundation for a commercial skyscraper is roughly 3 centimeters. The people building the Great Pyramid beat it with copper chisels and wooden sleds. The engineering problem isn't the cutting. It isn't even the transport. The problem is the asterisk schedule star. Herodotus reported a 20-year build time. For that number to work, and modern Egyptologists largely accept it, workers had to place approximately 800 blocks per day. That's 1 block every 108 seconds. Around the clock. Every day. For 20 years. No modern construction project of equivalent material volume has matched that rate using any technology. There is a second number most documentaries skip. The Grand Gallery inside the pyramid is 8.6 meters tall and inclined at exactly 26.5 degrees. The King's Chamber at its end is built from 100-ton granite blocks sourced from Aswan, 800 kilometers away. The acoustic resonance inside that chamber, measured in 2016 by the Acoustics Research Center, matches the resonant frequency of the human heartbeat at rest, 1.5 Hz. Whether that was intentional, no one knows. But the fact that it is not a coincidence a carpenter makes by accident. 4. Puma Punku, Bolivia, circa 500 CE. This is where the pattern breaks. Every other site on this list used round or irregular stones. Puma Punku, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level on the Bolivian Altiplano, used H-shaped interlocking blocks, some weighing 131 tons, machined to a surface flatness of less than half a millimeter. A flatness that, measured with a modern straightedge, would pass quality inspection in an aerospace fabrication facility. Archaeologist Alexei Vranich of UC Berkeley spent 7 field seasons at Puma Punku. His published conclusion was careful and specific: the cuts could theoretically have been made with stone and sand abrasion over sufficient time. What he couldn't explain was the consistency dozens of blocks, identical with intolerances that even skilled craftsmen working by hand for years would struggle to replicate on a single piece. The site was also hit by a catastrophic event, possibly an earthquake, possibly a flood, that scattered 131-ton blocks like a child knocking over wooden toys. Which means whatever broke it was moving forces large enough to shift 131 tons. And people built here anyway. That's not an engineering mystery. That's a psychological one. And it might matter more than the blocks themselves. Pattern interrupt, stop. Every monument we've covered so far has one thing in common that almost no one talks about. None of them are finished. Göbekli Tepe was buried mid-construction. Sacsayhuaman has unplaced stone still on the approach road. The Great Pyramid's casing is largely gone. Puma Punku was shattered. The next 2 sites on this list share that same characteristic, and when you line them all up, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a variable someone should be measuring. 5. Stonehenge, England, circa 1300 to 1500 BCE. The sarsen stones at Stonehenge weigh up to 25 tons and were transported from Marlborough Downs, 25 kilometers away. The blue stones in the inner ring weigh up to 4 tons and originated in the Preseli Hills in Wales, 240 kilometers. A 2019 University of Brighton study modeled the bluestone transport using Bronze Age technology and found that even the most favorable river and sledge route required coordinated labor across at least 4 distinct tribal territories. No evidence of conflict between those territories has been found in that period. Meaning whatever organized that transport did so peacefully, across generations, across cultures, with no surviving written agreement. The social engineering required may be harder to explain than the physical engineering. 6. The Nazca lines, Peru, circa 500 BCE or 500 CE. The lines are not the mystery. Removing the reddish surface stones to reveal pale ground beneath is achievable by hand. The mystery is the precision of the figures at scale: a hummingbird 93 meters wide, a spider 46 meters wide, drawn without any elevated vantage point from which to verify proportion. A 2018 study from Yamagata University identified the geometric method likely used, a grid system constructed with stakes and cord. It works. It replicates the proportions. But it requires someone to have designed the full figure in miniature *first*, then scaled it outward, which means there was a drawing. No drawing has ever been found. 7. Easter Islands Road, back to the beginning. Here is the number the hook promised you. Pablo Vargas measured the gap between those road stones at a consistent 0.3 mm across multiple test points along a 47-meter section. Not approximately. Not roughly. 0.3 mm, 1/3 of a single millimeter, repeated over and over by people working without calibrated instruments, without metal tools, and without, as far as the archaeological record shows, any surviving tradition that explains why the road needed to be that precise in the first place. The assumption you've held since the first time you heard the word ancient is that precision requires tools. Easter Islands Road is the standing proof that it doesn't. It requires something harder to manufacture than any tool ever found, an unbroken standard, held in human memory, passed from hand to hand across generations, tighter than anything we've bothered to write down. If you want to understand how that transmission worked, the field is called *embodied knowledge*, and it will change how you think about every monument on this list.